Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A with Dr. Hannah de los Santos from MITRE. This session is a complement to the bite-sized lunchtime talk you've already watched. I'll introduce my colleague BJ, who will introduce our speaker. Go ahead, BJ.
Hi, Dr. Hannah de los Santos is a lead data scientist in the model-based analytics department at the MITRE Corporation. She earned her Ph.D. in computer science and her master's degree in applied mathematics from the RPI, where she did research in building tools to detect circadian rhythms in large omics data. Her current work seeks to use data analytics techniques to solve problems in population health equity, including addressing social determinants of health, remodeling, and gentrification. Go back to you.
Thank you. It's so great to have you with us today, Hannah, Dr. de los Santos. And shout out to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute near New York State's capital, Albany. I spent a lot of time in Troy and Niskayuna, and I know we've commiserated around our love of that area, that very unique area. I'm sure our participants are excited to chat with you. MITRE represents an example of something, a place that does cool stuff with data. They're just coming out of a session with your colleague, Dr. Yahya Sheikh, and there's lots of excitement around your organization. So why don't we jump right in? To center us, can you start by telling us a bit about MITRE writ large? So for those people who are joining us for the first time, tell us about MITRE, tell us how you found your way to MITRE, and then let's have you talk a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. So MITRE is a federally funded, it runs basically federally funded research and development centers. So across the US in various spaces of the federal government. So anything from like transportation to health to defense to various places. And really the goal at MITRE is to solve problems for a safer world. That's the tagline. And so how I found MITRE actually was through my friend in my lab. His wife worked at MITRE, and I had a friend who interviewed at MITRE, and they did basically data analytics and data science, and we're doing it in all these different areas essentially, right? And I knew that that was something I wanted, and the ability to kind of focus on different things and be constantly learning new things was something I wanted. So the connection was there, and kind of went through that way. But yeah, MITRE is a pretty great place to work. I would highly recommend it.
And can you talk to us a little bit about the project that you presented in your video? And I know one of your colleagues is here, and if at some point Saimun would like to join us, just drop me a note in the chat box, and we'll bring you on camera as well and add you to our website. You know, we cite folks. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing?
Yeah. So I do think Saimun Habib is here. So like if he's here to join in. So both of us are on the social justice platform at MITRE, which seeks to develop capabilities to support project teams in including social justice and equity, hi Saimun, into our work. And so I am the lead for the data sources and analysis capability area in the social justice platform. And Saimun, I will let him introduce himself, but works on the modeling side. And also on this call, on this presentation, I also talked about some work that we did as part of a research project at MITRE, examining redlining and mental health across the US, and then also focusing on Baltimore as well to see a case study on how those associations are affected at a local level. And so Saimun, if you want to introduce yourself super quick.
Yeah, no, sure. Let's not go super quick. Saimun, where are you from? What do you do? Tell us your schools and stuff. And we're going to add you to the website. So smile, we're taking a picture of you right now. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Saimun. I'm originally from New Britain, Connecticut. I graduated from Harvard last year with a degree in stats and math. And the way I found myself at MITRE is actually I was in a research lab and someone posted some interesting research that came out of MITRE. And I was like, oh, wow, this looks like a great place to work. And one thing Hannah mentioned, their tagline is like solving problems for a safer world. And that really struck a bell with me. And I realized that's the environment I want to be in. Those are the sorts of problems I want to work on.
So go ahead.
I realized I didn't talk at all about what I'm doing at MITRE. So I've been at MITRE I'll be at MITRE for a year, I think in 2 weeks. And I've been working as an associate data scientist, mostly on the modeling team for the social justice platform.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question from one of our alumni from last year, Regis. So he wants to know, how does the work itself for MITRE come about? Are you responding to RFPs by sponsoring federal agencies and private entities? What other avenues does MITRE pursue to realize its research agenda?
Yeah. So I think it comes kind of both ways. So we get the federal government and their various areas do come to us, and we basically go through a work shaping process, right, of developing projects and trying to see what is good work for us to do. And that can start like either at a very early stage, like it's just kind of the idea in someone's head, or it can be kind of this much like longer process as well. And we also have like shorter term projects. So we work like, especially with like things that come out of the blue. So things like COVID, we've had like very short term COVID projects. We've had projects related to different like things that come about pretty recently. So there's a lot of basically talking and shaping things. But the other side also is we have this research end of the company that basically basically from like the leftovers of like the projects and the money gets pooled into some research funds that we can basically work on basically research projects that might be useful to the government in the future, and those could be picked up later on. So we develop those things that can be later on. And the example of the redlining work is an example of like a internally funded research project that could be picked up for the federal government later on. So it kind of goes both ways, if that makes sense.
Simon, did you want to add to that, or shall I jump to our next question?
Yeah, Hannah gave a great answer. I can elaborate a little bit on the internal research programs that we have. I'm personally on a project, and right now we're sort of in the thick of, okay, so we've done this research, we created these tools. How can we pitch this as something that the federal government can benefit from? And part of what that process looks like is identifying the agencies that can use these tools and identifying how it aligns with their mission priorities, their needs, and what value we can provide to them with our research.
So I'm interested in the connection between you and your clients. So MITRE's operational measures mentions adoption of SJP tools, capabilities, and subject matter expertise, and demonstrated impact on decisions. So like MITRE sponsored or other. Does this suggest a feedback loop between implementing SJP focused research and MITRE's own business practices? If so, can you kind of speak to how that happens?
Yeah, definitely. So that is definitely something that the SJP is for, right? So we want to develop these capabilities, and we want them to be put into use by these project teams, right? But these project teams either use them and then they realize, oh, I actually need this other thing, or I need guidance on this. And that informs kind of later on capabilities. So it is indeed like a feedback loop. An example of that is the equity assessment framework that the SJP put out, I think last year or so, got used by a project for the Veterans Association. And the people in that were like, oh, we actually need more guidance on how to like actually go to our sponsors with like the results of our analysis, right? And that kind of informed a guide that we're developing on integrating equity into like data analysis, right? So it's this kind of thing that it's always working, it's always developing, right? But you start with something, and it is like this feedback loop that does kind of inform both future work and our work and helping out. Yeah.
A follow-up question related to your video. So you stated in the video that there's no one-size-fits-all model when it comes to your clients. Can you talk a bit more about the limits of generalizability too, and do you plan and how you address that in follow-on research?
Yeah. So I think when I talked about the no one-size-fits-all model, I was referring to the redlining work.
Yes.
But yeah. So so what we found when we were doing the redlining work, right, was so we did this basically this national analysis where we applied redlining to like looking at mental health across the entire US. Right. And so what we found was that the associations for that were entirely different depending on the city, right? Because redlining was a local process, right? They worked with local people. They figured out like, okay, what are the grades going to be based on those areas? And so it was a local process, right? And so we found that if you applied like a blanket model of redlining and mental health across like every city in the US and you kind of bin them together, you're not going to get anything that's actually really meaningful, right? So you really need to dig down into that local level in order to kind of find out if there's actually something like what the relationship actually is, and what that might mean locally for the impacts of redlining in present day, if that makes sense.
Did you want to add to that, Saimun? Or I do have another question before we open it up to our to all the amazing PhD students, junior faculty, and postdocs in the audience. Would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. I can say from my experiences working on some other projects, there is no one perfect model. And something that's really emphasized at MITRE is you need like a model of many different models, and like using multiple models approach, you can get closer to the truth, whatever that may be, because really what a model is it's just one way to look at a problem and framing it according to some mathematical definitions. And if you can incorporate those different perspectives, then you can get a better answer. And MITRE is really able to take advantage of all the various backgrounds of all the people here to come up with those answers.
Thank you. So we had one last question from one of our alums, again, Regis, and I believe he was referencing the redlining project. So he wanted to hear you talk a little bit about radical solutions. So he said, during your presentation, I was reminded of Patrick Sharkey's Stuck in Place. One of his key takeaways was the racial inequality is that racial inequality is organized in space, specifically ghettos, and inequality can essentially compound over time. He ends up arguing for multi-generational, broad-based public policy agendas to promote investment sustainability over time, sans gentrification. Based on what your team found, consideration of historical factors paired with place-based interventions are critical. But how do we go beyond that to the policy level, and what might be the most radically effective solutions in your view?
Oh, that's such a tough question, right?
I know, right? He's not here to ask it. I have to carry that for him.
Well, so I think it's a tough question because it goes back to kind of that no one size fits all, right? Because it especially also there are so many things to kind of unpack there, right? So in that being a no one size fits all, I think working with the communities to actually find out what is actually impacting their residents and what actually can make a difference for them, right? It's not necessarily like, so we obviously took a broad look, but then we kind of zoomed in on Baltimore, right? And we saw that like, oh, there are all these investments, all these different things that are impacted by redlining, but also these other place-based factors that are kind of tying in as well, right? So it's a combination of knowing the scope, but then working with the community, and then also asking them like, what is actually going to help over time, right? So I think that is generally something to kind of think about. In terms of multi-generational, like over time, I think that's something that is really important to do, right? Like, you cannot solve the effects of redlining in a day. That's not going to happen. In fact, we are like 80 to 90 years from it, right? And we're still seeing effects of these things, right? So I think that it's there. I don't necessarily have like an idea of a specific solution, but I think I have to kind of turn it around and say, like, what can we do locally to actually do, like, fix these effects, and try to take these into account when we're making decisions for our communities, where we're putting our money, where we're putting, like, all of our improvements. And so I think, yeah, so I'm kind of turning back a little, but yeah, I think that is my answer.
Hey, Simon, do you want to take this one too, or are we going to open it up to the gallery?
I think Hannah's answer was great, and I don't want to speak too much to it, especially because I didn't work on Hannah's project. So
well done, well trained, sir, well trained. All right, we're gonna open it up to Amber. Amber's gonna kick us off with our first question. Amber, Erica, Nayantara, then BJ. But by all means, anybody else with questions, get your hands up. We'd love to hear from you. Take it away, Amber.
Hi guys, thank you so much for your research and for just sharing more about what you guys do. It's been really interesting to hear. My question was on gentrification specifically, which was talked about on the video. I was wondering if you could give some more information. How is gentrification in certain cities impacting the contemporary relevance of whole grades? And I was also curious, as a second question, if you could talk about the 2 cities where the whole grade negatively correlated with mental health outcomes. What were those cities, and do you have any theories about why we saw that?
Yeah. So I think both of those go hand in hand, right? So gentrification is not something that we've directly measured. We're actually starting to kind of get into that. But what we found is that if you look at redlining, so obviously those communities have been disinvested, right? They haven't had much, like, money put into them, right? And so what happens is that they're basically ripe for gentrification to come in, right? And so what we're seeing is that gentrification can almost, like, reverse the effects. And that's even true when we were looking at Baltimore, right? That L that's in the center, that basically had the opposite in terms of mental health prevalence, poor mental health prevalence effects. And then the last thing that you talked about was, the 2 opposite cities. So I don't have them off the top of my head, but what we found was that they were negatively correlated, but it wasn't so much, the magnitude wasn't very high, right? So it was much closer to, like, something that's, like, probably like 1, like, or so. I'm obviously, like, talking off the top of my head, so do not quote me on the numbers exactly. But it definitely wasn't a super high magnitude. So it was more like they were being moderated more than anything else, if that makes sense. And I hope I answered everything, if I remembered everything.
Our next question is from Erica and her occasional cat walking by in front of her computer. Cute little fuzzy butt. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. The video was great. So my question is related with the data and the model, and I have a couple of questions. So the first one is, considering the data your team used in the model, are all the data set publicly available? And then the second question is, in your model, you use different data sets that probably they have different unity of analysis. What was the final scale of analysis of your model? And then the third question is, could you talk a little bit more about the outcome you choose for your model and the reason your team choose this particular outcome for mental health, not other outcome? And then my last question is, considering the impact of the headlines has been impacting community over time since their implementation, do you think it would be interesting to incorporate variables that show change over time in your model?
Yeah. Okay. So let's hope that I can remember all of these. So
Erica, can you drop them in the chat box for us too? Because we want to make sure we get to all those. And if no one has seen it yet, I wrote, Erica is not playing. Erica is a question beast. Okay, so please drop those in the chat box for us, Erica, so we can cover them all. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of the data, all the data is publicly available from publicly available sources. So we basically took a lot from Census, so American Community Survey data. We took particulate matter data, which we built actually into a package that's available on GitHub. And we also have the places data from CDC, that's also publicly available. And the redlining maps have recently been digitized, and that's also available. So yes, so all of that is free for the taking and using. Thank you for posting that. And then also in the model, yes, we use different data sets. So we use census tract, the census tract level, which is generally relatively small. I think it's somewhere between like 4,000 people to 8,000 people in a census tract roughly. And so that was generally our scale of analysis that we were doing. But we did those for every city in the US for all the red line cities. So there were 202 cities, all the census tracts in those cities that had a red line grade. So for the outcome, we chose poor mental health prevalence from CDC places. And that was largely because it existed, unfortunately. So with like when you're trying to do these national scales, these national analyses at such a low level, at such a small level, you find that you're very limited in terms of what data is actually there. And so the CDC places is a relatively new data set, I think released for the first time in like late 2020. That was across the entire United States. And so that generally drove our choice in the specific measure of outcome. But in terms of just mental health in general, that's something we've been kind of interested in on the social justice platform as well. So we've developed a mental wellness index. And so that kind of led us into like examining what that relationship was. And so in terms of including stuff over time, yes, oh my gosh, we definitely wish we could include stuff over time. Because I think, so when you're doing like this analysis, looking at something that happened in the 30s to like what happened literally like today, right? There's obviously this huge time gap, and there's also changes in terms of like dynamics in terms of the population, right? That are changing over time. And so that's definitely something we would love to track. Unfortunately, obviously, as people change over time, also geographic units change over time, right? So census tract boundaries change. Also, we found that a lot of the older data is not actually digitized in terms of census data. So unfortunately, like a lot of that can't actually be done unless you're looking at a very small city, right, where you can kind of hand digitize it yourself. So for a national analysis, it's like not currently in the scope, but that's something that is definitely good to do, especially if you're looking at a low level, right? If you're looking only in one city, that's definitely something that I would highly recommend. That's a great idea.
All right, Nayanthara has our next question.
Hi, thank you, Dr. De Los Santos, as well as Saimun. This was super interesting. I really enjoyed the video that you posted about the redlining, and I learned a lot about MITRE as well. I have two questions. One is about your workflow, and the other is about what you see the future of MITRE to be. And I'm going to drop those in the chat. And I'll just read those out as well. So can you describe your workflow while working on a project with multiple collaborators with different skill sets, and how many projects would you typically be working on at a time? And also, do you think that the tools developed by MITRE, such as the Mental Wellness Index and the Federal Inclusivity Index, as well as the Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Index, could it be expanded globally? And if so, what kind of global partners would MITRE be interested in collaborating with? Like, would you think like academics or think tanks, industries or governments? Like, what would be the direction that you see MITRE going in?
Great questions. And the first one is especially important, is they're about to jump into group projects with people across different experiences and skill sets. And that's how they'll be spending this whole next week. So I'm sure everyone's going to be leaning in on this one. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the redlining work and also just other projects. So you mentioned the Mental Wellness Index, the Federal Inclusivity Index, all of those were different people with different skill sets, right? So for example, in the redlining work, I come from a computer science, data science background, working with people in public health, right? People in health policy. Actually, I'm talking about it because I'm the lead, but this was all led by Elizabeth Murphy, who is a health policy analyst at MITRE. And in collaboration with a data scientist, Juliana Bernardi, who led the actual data science work. So basically we worked in an interdisciplinary way. So I think as a a data scientist, as a person working in data, you have to learn to communicate the work that you do, right? And make sure that things like R-squared, things like p-values are understandable to people who don't necessarily understand like the mathematical rigor behind like some of these concepts, right? But make sure that they understand the significance, the importance of it. And so that I think is like something that kind of goes across any multidisciplinary field. And in terms of projects that projects that we're working on over time, I think generally people work on like 2 projects at a time, roughly. That can be more or less depending on like short-term projects that come up and stuff like that. Some people only work on 1 project as well. So I think it really depends on the specific area, but usually it's about 2 in the data science field. And maybe I'll also stop here to let Saimun like insert on this question for his experience.
Yeah, so right now I'm actually on 3 projects, and something that I've found really important to making sure I'm able to work on all 3 of those teams effectively is staying organized. And what that looks like for me is keeping like a to-do list for each of my projects. Invariably at the end of the day, my to-do list is always longer than the start of the day. And also making sure I have like a running notebook of my progress, my ideas, what worked, what didn't work, the results that I'm getting. And in terms of working effectively in teams that have diverse backgrounds and skill sets, it's important to keep an open mind. And I find that working in these teams, there's a lot of learning and teaching going on, both in tandem. So Hannah mentioned that as data scientists, we have to be able to share our results and not only just deliver those results, but explain why they're important. But a lot of data science would be useless if we don't have like the domain specific interpretations of our results and like what that might mean with clinical data, for example. So it's important to be able to learn quickly from your peers, especially when they do have that field knowledge, and being able to incorporate that into the various models that you build.
And then on the second question, the tools developed by MITRE expanding globally, I think they definitely could. That's definitely something that we haven't really thought of a ton. But I think if the data is there, right, these are frameworks that can be applied in other spaces, right? So thinking off the mental wellness index, which is what I worked on, that is like a framework that does have customizability in it, right? So if you took like the same idea, tick all the measures, but maybe put it in the UK, right? And looked at like what their areas are, right? So it's the idea of a framework that can be applied. And so I think because we haven't explored that, I can't necessarily say who we would work with to do that. But I would say we're definitely open to it for sure. So if you know anyone, or if anyone knows anyone, happy to reach out.
Before I turn it over to BJ for our next question, so we focused quite a bit on Baltimore in a lot of our conversations. Can you talk about other focus cities that MITRE has worked on, and what types of projects?
Yeah, so I'll actually hand that to Saimun, because I think this is good to talk about the DC work.
Yeah. So one of the other big projects that the modeling team in the social justice platform has worked on is a racial wealth gap analysis of Washington, DC. What this research project was for, it was to create like a shared understanding of the wealth building system in DC, how it operates, and really identifying points of change. And the way we went about doing this is we combined a lot of quantitative data from like the census, for example, as well as qualitative data from DC residents. So while the census data can give us like a picture of how wealth is distributed and how it's concentrated, our interviews from these local participants give us a better understanding of the systems that guide their wealth and where their money is going to. And so using these two different data sources, we were able to create this really complex systems dynamic graph of like all the big factors from employment stability to income, workforce readiness, assets, debts, home ownership, and the social networks that people are in, and map out how they're related to one another. And using this, we were able to identify like the big feedback loops within this really complex graph that seems to determine how wealth is changing in DC. In terms of how this is useful, we actually worked with the Council Office of Racial Equity in the mayor's office, and they are actually using our research to do their racial equity impact analysis for different pieces of legislation that passes through the mayor's office. And they're using this systems graph to analyze what parts of the system a different policy might impact, what that means for other factors further down in the system.
We have a follow-up question for you, Saimun. I can tell that folks are thinking about getting together in groups. So Renee, can you jump in, and then we'll go Bing, Nayantara, and then Andrea.
Yes, hi. Thank you all for being here and sharing, your journeys and experiences. Just a follow-up question. You talked to Saimun. You talked about having being on 3 projects. I was just wondering, I know being on projects, leading versus having a role within the projects may be somewhat different. So I was wondering, in terms of capacity, the 3 projects that you're on right now, are you leading those, or you are leading one, or you have a role in one? If you don't mind expanding on that, thank you.
Yeah, so I am a very junior member of MITRE. This is like my first year out of college, so I'm not really leading projects at the moment. My role is generally being like a contributor to the projects. However, my project leads have entrusted me to do or find on my own like what works, and like trust me to deliver those results. And I found that if you think you're right about something or on how it works, the best way to do that is to get the results that show that. So there is like a sort of independent leadership that you have to take on your own in projects, because they can't just prescribe to you what they want. They also expect you to find and unearth new things.
All right, our next question is from BJ.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for both of you being here. I really enjoyed the video. So I wonder, like, the data set you are utilizing are actually from different years. So do you do it purposely to see the causal relationship, or just because it's public health data, so you have no choice? And I totally understand. I encountered the same problem. And my other question is, how do you decide the 19 covariates? I heard you say that the literature, but compared with other, I think a lot of the papers, they use a lot of feature engineering to lower down the dimensions. So I wonder how you balance those problems. And the other one is, the reason I ask the question is because actually my dissertation focused on the disparity in mental health care utilization and among people with a suicidal behavior. But I'm using the Optum data, the private insurance data. So however, because my committee member, they are the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the epidemiologists. So actually we focus on the causal relationship, so we could have generate some policy implication. So I just wonder that when you encounter some questions, like when people ask you about how do you study racial disparity, then there might be a lot of collinearity issues. For example, the race related to socioeconomic status. So how can we, what's your suggestions about when we study disparity, how we narrow down whether these issues is caused by specific social determinants of health? And I know it's very hard, but I want to ask about your opinions. And the other questions I want to ask is, are you hiring?
I'll answer that one first. Yes. So I think if you go to like MITRE.com and then there's like careers or MITRE.org rather, I think you can probably find what jobs are available. So I don't know any like off the top of my head, but I would definitely look. So I think the data years issue, yes, it's an issue. You were totally right. It's based on basically availability, right? And so luckily a lot of our data sets are like relatively close together. So they're usually about a couple years off. I mean, minus redlining, which was 1930, and that was the point. So there was definitely a data availability issue. So I think in the future would definitely be really good to align them, but we were prioritizing the most recent over that. In terms of how we narrowed down. So yes, so we started with a ton of covariates and looked at a bunch of different covariates that we had. And basically what we did was basically went through all the models and basically ordered, just looking at univariate models for the different cities and these different covariates, and basically ordered them by like the different covariates by like count, by p-value, by r-squareds, and then by AIC values, and then identified the most common covariates within certain categories. And that also, I think, kind of helps with the collinearity that you described as well, right? So we didn't necessarily include, we included non-white, right, in general. So we binned all of those together, knowing that there are different categories that of races that are in different areas, right? So we basically narrowed down to specific categories, and I think that helps a lot with the collinearity problem. But in general, and the other thing I want to mention, this is definitely not a causal study. This is just looking at associations only. But I think when you're wanting to look at like these different like social determinants of health and look at like current health outcomes, I think trying to choose the best one, I think is a little tough, right? Especially on things that can't necessarily be like easily changed, right? So unemployment rate is something that maybe you could create more jobs, right? But is that like really hard in like a specific community? So I think that it's tough. I think I would probably look at the actual impacts when you actually look at the model that you make, right? The magnitudes, but also scaled, right? Because if they're all on different scales, you're obviously going to get different results. But if putting them on the same scale, seeing the magnitudes, maybe seeing where those like lie, that might be a good way of starting to look at things. Simon, I don't know if you have any ideas on multicollinearity and like also like whichever has the most impacts. I think that's really hard to kind of say on a general sense.
Yeah, so it's a pretty tough problem for any data scientist. You know, you could do like a few things like principal component analysis and other dimension reduction stuff, but that sort of gets away from what each of your variables mean. One thing that you can do is look at how important each variable is, which is another approach that we took in modeling which assets are most important for changes in wealth in different households. And you know, one way you can do that is doing like a random forest to get at those importances.
Yeah, so hopefully that answers a little bit. But yeah, it's definitely a really hard problem.
We have, I'm going to let Erica jump the line here because she has a job question.
Okay, this is just following up what when BJ asked about being able to be hired. So actually, after I saw the video, I was like, oh, that would be an interesting thing, that it would be very interesting to work outside academia, right? And then I went to your website and I checked, and I was like, oh, but they just hire U.S. citizens. Do you know the reason why is that, and why?
Yeah. So since we work with the federal government, a lot of us have to get security clearances. And so that usually precludes that pretty much. So unfortunately, yeah. But I would definitely like, I think for our department, we are required to have security clearances. But I think in the health space, there are generally less people with security clearances. So it might be worth like poking around more in that space and seeing what's available there. Because I do agree, like working at MITRE is kind of like a happy medium between industry and academia, right? You're still doing kind of research in a general way, but you are not like grants or like teaching driven. So it's a really nice kind of happy medium in general from what I found.
I was writing to Erica telling her, you could be the first, apply, you never know.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, exactly.
You know, Nayanthara, you're up next.
So thank you both for answering my questions earlier. My question was also about a job, which BJ and Eric have already asked, but I was kind of mostly asking about, wanting to know a little bit more about what kind of internship as well as job opportunities would you say that there were there for international folks? I know that you did answer that about the health, like that division might have more opportunities for us, but also what kind of flexibility do you have on working on your own projects, say after your PhD, like, you know, can you like work out on your own projects? Do you have your own co-authors from academia? Like, can you work on that as well on the side?
Yeah. So I think, so the international question, I definitely would like, I do not know as much because I am a US citizen, so I have not like looked too deeply into it. So I would definitely like reach out for sure. Also, just like in general, the contact information that is like listed on the website, would highly recommend just like reaching out and asking, because worst possibility that they say is no, right? And so, yeah, and then in terms of, oh, sorry, I forgot the second question immediately. What was it? Sorry.
It was about like, do you have the flexibility to work on your own projects post PhD?
Yes. Yeah. So yes, you do. So there are a few different ways to kind of go about it. So you can obviously work on your own time outside of MITRE. All you have to say is, I'm working on it, and they'll be like, okay. I have like some packages from like my PhD work that I work on like entirely out of like work hours and stuff like that. So that is definitely a thing that you can do. There's also the early career like funding as well. So when like at MITRE, if you're like within, I believe, like 5 years of your last degree, you can apply to basically work on an independent research project on your own. And so that can be work from your PhD that you might want to work on. And then you could also parlay that into like those internal research projects, right? Bigger projects. If you started with something in your PhD and you're like, I think this could be a bigger thing, a bigger project, you could just propose it as a project to work on with internal funding, right? So there are definitely different spaces to continue your work if you want to.
I'm gonna jump in because I'm seeing many requests for your contact information.
Yeah,
I've written this to Dr. De Los Santos privately, but I'm just like, you're on my like academic crush list. Why are you such a badass? You know, so you know, you're cool too, Simon. So please drop your information in the chat box for our participants. I also want to add a comment there. So I have quite a few friends working in various places in the federal government. As many of you know, I was a presidential management fellow. When you're interviewing for those jobs, that's a great time to have that conversation. You know, I have independent research projects, they overlap with this, and try and get that worked in so that you get a certain percentage of your time on the job when you're getting paid, when you can do that. It's harder to do that after the fact, but it does happen. A friend of mine has gotten that at both Treasury and the Fed. So ask those questions. All right, we have another question. So far I see Hannah, Dr. De Los Santos's information in the chat box. Andrea, you're next.
Good afternoon. What a great presentation, and thank you guys so much for being here. My question was really towards Simon, and I thank you very much for dropping the study, the DC study in the chat, because I live in DC. And I was just wanting to know, when you were doing this study, did you look at just the DC area, or did you look at outside the DC area? Because Virginia and Maryland and DC are so closely intertwined. And I was just wondering, from a wealth perspective, did you consider that? The other reason why I say that is because a lot of people can't afford to live in DC and actually have to live in an outlying area. And so I was just wondering, did you interview folks that were not necessarily living in the DC area?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, we limited the scope of the study to just DC, especially because we were doing the study on behalf of and in conjunction with the Council Office of Racial Equity of DC. So unfortunately, we didn't look at like the outlying neighborhoods in Virginia or Maryland.
Thank you.
All right, Imani gets the last word and already dropped the questions in advance. Leadership.
So I dropped the questions because I'm having like issues with audio. So I apologize if you already answered these or any variation of this, but I was really curious about how you all measured impact on the social justice platform. I heard you talk about measuring impact for your clients, but I was wondering for the platform itself, what you all were doing. And then also you talked about a few projects, but I was wondering if there was anything in particular that y'all experiencing in positions that you were really proud of that you necessarily just didn't get a chance to talk about yet. So if you wanted to share that.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank you, Dr. Munyaka. Continue.
Yeah. So in terms of measuring impact, so there are a couple different ways that we've kind of looked. Obviously, the adoption of like the capabilities that we're developing, right? So are people using them? Are people coming to the website? Definitely share the website. And like actually using things, right? So those are the kinds of things that we measure. Also, what are we doing, right? So we like generally also provide subject matter expertise, right? For like projects that want to integrate equity. So are we consulting on different projects? Are we like actually helping out when people ask us, right? So those are the kinds of things that we kind of tracked. And then in terms of an example of a particular project that I'm really proud of, I think a lot of the work in MITRE I've done that I'm pretty proud of, but the one that I haven't really talked a lot about is the mental wellness index that we developed. And I will find the link and I will put it in the chat. It's also on the social justice platform. But it was basically, it's basically a measure of mental wellness, so mental health and substance use across the US, not only for overall populations, but also Black populations, right? And developed with a social justice lens in mind across 28 measures across social determinants of health, health status, and healthcare access. And that was all aligned at the zip code level, so a pretty granular level as well. And so I'm pretty proud of like the fact that we were able to put that out and that it actually is useful to people. So that's something I'm pretty proud of. And Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, so I already talked about the racial wealth gap report, but I am pretty proud of that because when I joined MITRE, they were already sort of in the thick of it. So being put in a position where I had to get up to speed with the rest of the report, and then also being able to immediately contribute to that report, which eventually the report was published. I was pretty proud of that because it was like a whirlwind the first few months and felt like I was drinking out of the fire hose. So just getting my feet underneath me, being able to contribute to such an important and publicized piece of work coming out of MITRE felt really good and definitely made me feel like I was working at the right place.
I think that's a beautiful place for us to end. Incredible presentation, wonderful questions. Deeply appreciative of our participants as well as our speakers. You know, as we head into week 2 here, it's easy to sort of lose momentum. I think we're all a little tired in the second week, and your time and attention and your appreciation for our speaker shows, and I deeply appreciate that from our team here. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.